Please explain in detail about AP U.S. government and politics on required Supreme cases. 1. McCulloch vs. Maryland, 1819 Federalism. 2. U.S. vs. Lopez, 1995 Federalism. 3. Baker vs. Carr, 1962 Legislative Branch, Gerrymandering. And 4. Shaw vs. Reno, 1993 Legislative Branch, Gerrymandering. 1. McCulloch vs. Maryland, 1819 Federalism. McCulloch vs. Maryland is a landmark case in the history of American federalism. The case was decided in 1819 and arose from a dispute between the state of Maryland and the Second Bank of the United States. Maryland sought to impose a tax on the bank, which was a federal institution, arguing that states had the right to tax any entity within their borders. The bank's branch manager, James McCulloch, refused to pay the tax, prompting the state to sue. The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, had to determine whether Congress had the power to establish the bank and whether Maryland could tax a federal institution. Marshall concluded that the Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8, of the Constitution granted Congress the implied power to create the bank. He reasoned that this power was necessary and proper for executing the enumerated powers of the federal government, such as regulating commerce and collecting taxes. Marshall also ruled that Maryland could not tax the bank. He cited the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Clause 2, which states that the Constitution and federal laws are the supreme law of the land. Marshall argued that Maryland's tax on the bank interfered with the federal government's constitutional powers and was thus unconstitutional. 2. U.S. vs. Lopez, 1995, Federalism. U.S. vs. Lopez, 1995, is another significant federalism case. In 1990, Congress passed the Gun-Free School Zones Act, which made it a federal offense to possess a firearm within a school zone. Alfonso Lopez Jr., a high school student, was arrested for carrying a concealed handgun on school property and was charged under this law. The question before the Supreme Court was whether Congress had the authority to regulate firearms possession in school zones under the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, of the Constitution. The court, in a 5-4 decision, ruled that the law exceeded Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. Chief Justice William Rehnquist, writing for the majority, argued that the possession of a gun in a school zone was not an economic activity and had no substantial effect on interstate commerce. 3. Baker vs. Carr, 1962, Legislative Branch, Gerrymandering. Baker vs. Carr, 1962, addressed the issue of legislative apportionment, which concerns the way electoral districts are drawn. The case began when Charles Baker, a Tennessee voter, sued the state, arguing that the state's apportionment scheme was unfair because it did not reflect population changes, leading to unequal representation in the state legislature. The Supreme Court, in a 6-2 decision, ruled that Baker's claim was justiciable, meaning that it could be addressed by the courts, and that legislative apportionment was a justiciable issue. The case established the one person, one vote principle, which requires that legislative districts be roughly equal in population. This decision laid the foundation for future cases addressing gerrymandering and electoral districting. 4. Shaw vs. Reno, 1993, Legislative Branch, Gerrymandering. Shaw vs. Reno, 1993, focused on racial gerrymandering, a practice in which electoral districts are drawn to favor one racial group over another. The case arose when North Carolina created a majority-minority congressional district to comply with the Voting Rights Act, which sought to protect minority voting rights. The district's bizarre shape led to accusations that race was the primary factor in drawing the district lines. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, ruled that redistricting based on race must be held to a standard of strict scrutiny, meaning that it must serve a compelling state interest and be narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. The court held that while compliance with the Voting Rights Act could be a compelling state interest, the use of race as the predominant factor in drawing district lines is constitutionally suspect. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, writing for the majority, argued that the district's bizarre shape suggested that race was the primary consideration, rather than political or geographic factors. The decision in Shaw vs. Reno established that racial gerrymandering is subject to strict scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, setting a precedent for future cases involving race and redistricting. The court's ruling indicated that while protecting minority voting rights is important, the use of race as a predominant factor in redistricting can lead to racial discrimination and undermine the principle of equal protection under the law. In summary, these four cases, McCulloch versus Maryland, U.S. versus Lopez, Baker versus Carr, and Shaw versus Reno, touch on crucial aspects of U.S. government and politics. They illustrate the evolving nature of federalism, the limits of congressional power under the Commerce Clause, and the importance of fair representation and equal protection in the legislative branch. Each case has significantly shaped American jurisprudence and continues to influence contemporary legal and political debates.